Welcome back. And now we are joined in the studio by Mr. David Ranz, the political counselor and the spokesman for the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. Hello, sir, and welcome to our show.
Thank you, Dina. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I believe it's a big day for America. It's starting to choose its new president. The race has been going neck to neck with neither Obama nor Romney are securing a relieving lead. How do you see this election? What strikes you most about this election than previous ones?
Well, what you just described, obviously, is a key point, which is that it has been incredibly close. Neither of the two candidates have established a clear advantage, although we can talk about what the latest polls seem to indicate. But ordinarily, when a president is heading into his re-election campaign, there's a pretty clear sense about whether that person will be re-elected or not. That's not always the case, of course. We had a similar situation with President Bush when he faced John Kerry in 2004. That election was also very close, and in fact, the polling statistics at that time looked very similar to the statistics that we're seeing for this election.
Okay. What is in mind of the American voter when he chooses his coming president?
In general, Americans, like people from around the world, are focused very much on the issues in their community. We have an expression in American politics, all politics is local. And this is true as well. When I was here examining the Egyptian elections, and I would go out and talk to Egyptian voters, the kinds of things that they talked about that were affecting their votes are very similar to what Americans are concerned about. So obviously the economy is the big one. Although the situation has clearly improved over the last couple of years, unemployment is lower than it has been, but it's higher than it historically has been. So that's a big issue that's on the minds of many Americans. Other issues, things like the education system, health care, these are big issues. Generally speaking, Americans don't think a lot about foreign policy issues when they vote, for example. So although those are the kinds of things that obviously many of our friends around the world look at, they don't often play a huge role in the campaign discussions that go on between the two candidates.
Yeah. Sir, from your own point of view, who seems to be closer to seal the race to the White House, Obama or Romney?
Well, I don't have a personal view, but I'll give you some of the latest polling information.
Okay.
And for your viewers who are really interested in following American politics, I recommend an excellent blog called 538, which is on the New York Times website. It's written by an analyst named Nate Silver. And he looks at all the polling data that's available in the entire country and draws statistical conclusions based upon that. So overarching his conclusion, first of all, is that in the last day of the campaign, if you look at the national poll levels, President Obama had a slight advantage, maybe around 1.6%. What's more important is that that advantage has been increasing. So the national polls seem to be more and more in favor of President Obama. But of course, as you know, our elections are actually not competed at the national level. They're competed at the state level. And so it's much more important to look at the way in which the swing states, the key states that are going to affect the final outcome of the election, if you look at the last couple of days of polling, the overwhelming majority of the polls in all of the key swing states have been in favor of Obama. Now, that advantage is very small, and so none of them are decisive, but they show a clear advantage. And Nate Silver, when he does his statistical analysis of all of the available information, he gives it about a 92% probability that President Obama will be reelected, which is obviously a very high probability. The other interesting statistic to look at is the polling data that asks people not who will you vote for, but rather who do you think is going to be elected. Historically, that has actually proven to be a much better indicator of the results than the national polls. The most recent time that a poll organization asked that question was on Sunday, Gallup poll, and they found that 54% of Americans said they thought that President Obama would win, as opposed to 34% for Romney. That happens to be exactly the same statistics that came out at the end of the campaign in 2004, which led to a Bush victory over John Kerry, also in a narrow margin. So all of those indications are positive for President Obama, but it's no means a decisive victory yet.
Yeah, they are so close in this race, with a different 1% for Obama or something like that. What the voters see in Romney doesn't see in Obama.
Well, it's not, yeah, I mean, it's not really, it's difficult for me to answer that question, partially because I'm not actually in the United States right now. Clearly, in general, there are still severe economic problems in the United States.
Yeah.
And so one of the factors that people are certainly looking at is, are we convinced that the policies that President Obama has been pursuing have led to an improvement and will continue to lead to an improvement? Or do we think that those policies are not having the positive effect and should we go in a different direction? It's really a question of which one of the two candidates' philosophies you believe. Broadly speaking, the Democratic Party believes in the importance of the role of government. There are a lot of other aspects as well. The Republican Party believes in more limited government. And so that's a key issue, philosophical questions about taxes, whether raising taxes is an important part of dealing with the fiscal deficit, or whether it should all come from cuts in spending. Those are the kinds of questions that I think are the major factors in people's minds right now.
Okay. Some analysts and critics say that through the campaign of Obama and Romney, they are not much different in terms of domestic policies. So do you agree with that?
I think that it is true when you look at the American political spectrum and compare it with many of the European countries. It's a fair analysis that the spectrum is not as wide. We don't have socialists and communists in the United States, but you still have those parties in many European countries. We also don't have parties that one could arguably call fascist, which is also a feature of a number of countries in Europe. You have those two parties, and they are probably, broadly speaking, center-right and center-left. They're not, they don't have greatly differing perspectives, but there are still very significant differences between the two parties, both philosophically and on many policy issues. And I don't think it's true to say, and there are Americans who of course do say this, there are people who say, I'm not going to vote because honestly I don't see a difference between the two candidates. But I don't think that's true. There are clear differences, and I think that it doesn't require me to believe 100% in the policies of one candidate or another to nevertheless be able to analyze their policies and say, on average, I think this candidate represents my values more than this one does. And there are many areas where there are very clear differences.
Yeah. So regarding the third parties in America, like the Green Party,
yeah.
the Libertarian Party, they are barely, their voices heard
yeah.
prior to the elections.
Yeah.
What are the barriers facing these parties to compete strongly in the elections?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are many reasons why a third party has not taken off. You have had a couple of instances where you've had independent presidential candidates who have done reasonably well. The most recent one being the first election between Clinton and President Bush, where you had a third candidate, Ross Perot. But even when they've done reasonably well, it still has not been a large percentage. And then, of course, you had the instance in 2000 where Ralph Nader, who represented the Green Party, although he didn't do very well at all, but he probably did well enough in certain states potentially to have swung the election in George Bush's favor. There are a lot of structural reasons. Part of it is undoubtedly the way in which we finance elections. You need major organizations to be able to attract the finances that are going to be necessary, especially on a presidential level. I haven't heard the latest numbers, but in the last election, I think President Obama spent a total of something like $1 billion. And that kind of money, you need a major organization to raise that money. There are also structural reasons in the way our Congress is run that greatly prefer the two-party system. And as a result, you only have, I think in the Senate, you have 2 independents, both of whom lean toward the Democratic Party. And there aren't, as far as I know, any independents in the Congress.
Okay. In the past decades, rarely an American president who wins a second term do much than what he did in the first term. And even polls made by the CNN and NBC News Network says that most Americans believe that Obama will not do much in his second term if he wins it. How do you see that?
Well, first of all, that analysis is interesting, and it's different from what I have generally heard. I think if you ask most Americans, they would probably say that traditionally presidents in their second term can do more. And the reason why people think that, and I'm not sure if it's true or not, is that when you're running for election, you have all these other considerations, as I said, financial considerations, making sure that your constituents are happy with your policies. And those all play a role in your decisions when you're trying to pursue new initiatives. A president in a second term isn't running for anything. Because of our system, you're limited to 2 terms. At the end of that 8 years, you have to leave politics. And so there's an argument that many Americans make that in fact a second-term president, because he doesn't have the limitations of having to run for office again, can do more of what he really thinks is right for the country. And in fact, I mean, I can think off the top of my head of a couple of examples of major initiatives. One is, for example, President Reagan, during his second term, he passed a major immigration reform, the last immigration reform that we've had in the U.S. And then President Clinton, in his second term, he passed the Welfare Reform Act. And what's interesting in both of those cases is that each of those presidents took a major issue that had a great amount of appeal to the other party and made it a major focus of their initiative. And they had to, because in Reagan's case, Congress was controlled by Democrats, and in Clinton's case, Congress was controlled by Republicans. But those are 2 examples, and of course, Reagan also delivered his famous Berlin Wall speech in his second term, which is not an initiative, but I mean, one could argue that that was a milestone in the history of the Cold War. So there are certainly examples, and there's no reason to think that if President Obama were reelected, he wouldn't be able to have a major impact.
Yeah. Well, despite this, many analysts say that still the American voter will choose Obama because they believe he's the lesser of 2 evils. So is this true?
I think every voter votes partially for somebody and partially against somebody. And certainly when I was traveling around to polling stations here in Cairo and I talked to Egyptians about why they made their choices, there were certainly some people who said, I really liked this candidate, or I really like this candidate. But just as often there were people who said, this candidate scared me, or I was really nervous about this candidate, and so I'm not thrilled about this person, but he makes me more comfortable. You're going to see the same thing with the U.S. There are going to be plenty of people who really love President Obama or Mitt Romney, and they vote for that person because they really think that person is the right candidate. You're going to see other people who may not be so thrilled, but there's something about the other candidate that really bothers them, and so they'll vote. But it's not true that most Americans are voting for the lesser of two evils. What is true is that part of it is voting for the person you think is the best. Part of it may be voting against the person who you think is not going to be the right candidate.
Yeah. On another front here in the Middle East, people are eagerly watching the results of the American elections. When we see the presidential debates on foreign policies regarding Egypt and fighting terrorism and Libya, does these remarks from Obama and Romney measure up what they really believe, or just they are saying what the voter wants to hear?
Well, I mean, I think what you're saying is perhaps a little bit cynical, and certainly there are many people who complain that politicians say what the voters want to hear. I'm not that cynical. I think that politicians have real beliefs and they express those real beliefs. At the same time, they are also representatives of their people, of their constituents. And that may mean that in some cases they are going to promote policies that they may not 100% agree with because it's what their constituents are telling them they want. Part of being a leader is leading, which can mean trying to convince your constituents that a given policy is the right policy, even if they don't believe it. Being a leader isn't always following what your people think. Sometimes it's convincing them of the right approach, but sometimes it is following what they say. On foreign policy issues, broadly speaking, if you look at the outlines of U.S. foreign policy for at least the last couple of decades, there is broad bipartisan support for those basic policies. And I think if you watched, and if your viewers watched the debate between the two candidates that focused on foreign policy, they probably saw that there was a lot of areas where they agreed. And they would say, they said it very openly, I agree with President Obama, or I agree with Governor Romney on this issue. There will be, obviously, as there always is, some changes in emphasis and maybe some changes in nuance. But when it comes to Egypt, for example, Egypt is a strong friend and ally. It will remain a strong friend and ally no matter who wins the election. Our support for Egypt's democratic transition is going to continue to be strong. Our desire to see a strong system in place that respects human rights and the international obligations, all of those things are going to be part of our foreign policy in Egypt, regardless of who wins the election.
Okay. As you said, they agreed at some points, like the U.S. relations with Russia and China, and also the Israel security. Mm-hmm. But Obama and Romney also parted when it comes to Iran's ambitious program, and they also parted on Libya and Egypt. When Romney comes to power, we will witness changes regarding Tehran?
Number one, it's not for me to predict what a President Romney might do. Your viewers can watch the campaign and the debates and decide for their own whether they think he will make changes or not. But if you look at the two candidates' statements on Iran, the basic point was the same. I mean, I don't agree with their premise actually that there was a big difference. They both said that a nuclear Iran, that meaning an Iran that pursues nuclear weapons, is unacceptable, and the U.S. Will not allow it to happen. And they both agree on the importance and the success of the sanctions regime. So I don't think that I saw a huge difference between the two, but I can't predict what President Obama might do. I mean, even if he were reelected, there is certainly the possibility that he'll make some changes. Foreign policy always evolves in response to what's going on the ground. But I didn't see any huge differences there.
Yeah. Sir, when we talk about Syria, the Palestinian-Israeli peace negotiations, will America, after the elections, will take a tougher stance regarding Syria? For example, they will stand behind the opposition to topple Bashar al-Assad?
Our position on Syria is very clear. We already support the opposition. We have made it clear that we believe that President Assad should step down. We want to see a peaceful transition to a democracy. We want to see the Syrian people enjoy the same freedoms that the Egyptian people have learned to enjoy, as well as countries like Tunisia and Libya. We want to see a united opposition that's capable of responding to the needs of the Syrian people and can transition to a new government. That policy is exactly the same policy as the Egyptian government. In fact, I think we in the Egyptian government agree almost 100% on our approach to Syria. We also agree that it's not a good idea to arm the opposition. And again, in the debate, I didn't see the two candidates outline the same basic parameters for their approach to Syria that I've just described. And I expect that will continue and also obviously evolve as the situation on the ground evolves. But we share the Egyptian government and President Morsi's great concern about the tragedy that's going on in Syria. And we will have senior American officials at the Doha conference later this week. And their goal will be to promote a unified opposition that can stand as a single voice to take on the responsibility of representing the Syrian people.
Yeah, but not interfering, it's just dialogue and with the opposition and standing behind, but not interfering on the ground.
What do you mean by not interfering on the ground? I mean, we share, as I said, we share with the Egyptian government.
No, I mean, you're not going to give, as you said, you're against the arming the opposition.
Right.
Yeah. So you're not going to go into war.
Well, there's any kind of direct intervention would have to be sanctioned by the UN with the support of the Arab League. So, I mean, we're not going to do anything independent, obviously. Our position is broadly supported by the international community, with some exceptions, obviously. But the point here, your basic question, was about any changes that we might see with the new, with the election, and I don't think there will be major changes. I think that we will continue to pursue this policy, and we will continue to strongly support the Egyptian government's role as they have so far taken in trying to resolve this crisis.
Okay. Sir, as you said, America, they are supporting the Arab countries and topping their authoritarian regimes. We recall Obama's remarks when there was attack on the American embassy here in Cairo. He said that Egypt is Americans' ally no more. Mm-hmm. So how do you see the future relations between Washington and Egypt under the ruling of the Islamists now?
Okay. First of all, I want to emphasize that Egypt is both a friend and an ally. Mm. And we expect that to continue. Our position on Egypt has been and will always be that we support the democratic transition. We wanted to see that the elections were an accurate reflection of the will of the people. We also recognize that elections in and of itself don't make a democracy. A democracy requires good governing institutions, a commitment to the rule of law, a commitment to protecting human rights, and being in conformity with international obligations, international agreements having to do with these issues. That is, broadly speaking, what we hope to see in Egypt, and that is what the Egyptian people want to see in Egypt. Our goal is to support the aspirations of the Egyptian people, and that will continue. Regardless of who wins the election, that basic perspective is going to continue. It is not for us as Americans to choose the leadership of the Egyptian government. That is a decision for the Egyptian people. And so whoever the Egyptian people choose, we will work with them. We will consult with them. We will raise our concerns if we see any concerns. But more importantly, we will find a way to support their desire to build a more democratic system with institutions that can meet the needs of the Egyptian people, both politically, economically, socially, across the spectrum.
Okay. Romney had earlier criticized Obama's administration with its stance with Egypt regarding the in the wake of the U.S. embassy attack. Are we expect that under the Romney's leadership there will be changes in relations with Egypt?
I'm going to go back to what I said before, which is, broadly speaking, I expect continuity in our foreign policy, and I expect continuity in our foreign policy, particularly here in Egypt. Yeah. I can't predict what a Romney administration would do specifically, but I do believe that all of the basic principles that I outlined, that we base our policy with respect to Egypt on right now, will continue.
Sir, I believe it's really an interesting issue. It's only hours for the the vote, and I hope we see the new president of America. We're honored to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Mr.
It's been a pleasure.
Ranz, the political counselor for the American Embassy in Cairo and a spokesman. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Well, this brings us to the end of our episode today. I'm Dina Mamdouh. Thank you for watching.